I'm joined today by Dr. Travis Campbell. He's one of the Reasons to Believe visiting scholars. And we're talking about St. Anselm and a unique argument that he gave in the early Middle Ages. Travis, Anselm was a very pivotal figure in Christian theology and apologetics. He was in the monastery and a life of devotion, prayer, and study. And he came up with an argument that I think has kind of turned the Christian world upside down in terms of apologetics. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Anselm and his unique argument.
Well, I think Anselm was searching for that argument that anyone could, or rather that would prove that you can know God before encountering anything else in the world. Imagine a man stuck in a dungeon or a cave, and he doesn't have access to the outside world. Can that person still know God?
Prior to any kind of experience, seeing or that kind of thing.
Yeah, so prior to experience, we can know God. And the idea is to pick up on this common Christian intuition that the knowledge of God is innate to us. And the ontological argument is meant to sort of exploit that common Christian intuition.
Now, that word ontological, why that word in defining the argument?
Well, the word, the label ontological, the ontological argument was not really a label that Anselm gave to it. It was the label that Immanuel Kant gave to it when he was critiquing the argument.
Okay, very good.
So a lot of people would joke that while Kant was destroying the argument, he built a gravestone, put ontological argument on there, and that's where the argument gets its name from.
Now, my understanding is that in some respects, this argument came out of Anselm's prayer life. Reading Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So here is a monk, Christian monk in the Middle Ages, right, whose devotion and thought merged together.
Very well, and some people have tried to suggest, or they have suggested, that Anselm is not really giving an argument for God. He's simply giving a prayer that some people have turned into an argument for God. I happen to be among those who interpret Anselm as actually trying to argue and prove, QED, that God does exist. The ontological argument, the word ontological means the study of being. And so Anselm is trying to prove that God is the necessary being. And the flow of the argument is simply that the idea of God proves the reality of God. In other words, the fool has said in his heart there is no God precisely because the proposition God does not exist entails a contradiction.
So let's then kind of unpackage that a little bit, that the idea of God somehow defines that God exists. How does Anselm kind of lay it out? How does he communicate it?
The first premise of the argument usually starts off with modern reconstructions of the argument would offer as the first premise of Anselm's argument that God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. And the justification from that would come from two sources. First, if you could think of something greater than God, then that would be God.
Okay.
And second of all, it's grounded in Scripture. Think of Hebrews 6, where we read of God, it says, God can swear by no one greater than himself. So even God cannot conceive of a greater than God, and therefore God is the greatest conceivable being. Now, the next premise would be that which exists in reality is greater than that which exists in the mind alone. The greatest conceivable being at least exists in the mind because even the atheist knows what he's rejecting when he rejects the existence of the greatest conceivable being, namely God. But if you agree with me that which exists in reality is greater than that which exists in the mind alone, then if you say God does not exist or the greatest conceivable being does not exist, that means automatically that I can conceive of a greater than the greatest conceivable being, namely one that does exist in reality. And so, again, the idea that God does not exist entails a contradiction. And because the proposition God does not exist entails a contradiction, that proposition must be false. In other words, God must exist in every logically possible world.
So Anselm uses this expression, God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. Then the second premise, that things that exist in reality are greater than those that exist only in mind. But this creates kind of an absurdum argument in the sense that you show that the denial of God results in an absurdity.
Yes.
And therefore God must exist.
Yes, it is a reductio ad absurdum argument. That's why my students often get confused, because when I'm giving the argument, I will often give the atheistic premise in the argument itself, namely, God does not exist, or the greatest conceivable being does not exist. But the point of doing that is to show how that premise entails an absurdity or a contradiction. And this would be another way of saying God is a necessary being. He must exist in all logically possible worlds, and since this world, the actual world, is a logically possible world, God exists in the actual world.
So Anselm is a student of Scripture. He knows Romans 1. He knows that God's existence is known to all creatures.
Yes.
He's familiar with Psalm 14:1, and he's thinking through the implications of this, and he comes up with this argument that later is called the ontological argument. And I know from my own studies in philosophy that some people think it's a sound argument, some people think it's unsound, but nobody is left unfascinated by it. It's just one of the most fascinating arguments in the history of Western civilization.